Hello everyone, welcome to this EUCROSS webinar. Today's discussion is focused on world politics after the COVID-19 outbreak, reflections on EU-Russia relations. I'm Andrione-Moylan from the Leuven Center for Global Governance Studies at KU Leuven, and I will be your moderator today. We have already witnessed how the pandemic has affected our lives, but what will be its consequences on international relations in general, and more specifically, relations between the EU and Russia? This is the question this panel will address. In the first part, Dr. Nadia Arbatova, head of the Department on European Political Studies at the Institute of the World Economy and International Relations in Moscow, Russia, will discuss the pandemic's consequences for world politics, where the COVID-19 crisis seems to constitute a catalyst for existing trends. In the second part, Dr. Sergey Utkin, head of the strategic assessment section at the same institute, focuses on the effect of the pandemic on the EU as an international actor, as well as EU-Russia relations. This will be followed by comments and questions by Irina Petrova, Dr. Irina Petrova, postdoctoral researcher at Kent University in Canterbury, and Professor Kolja Raube, assistant professor for European Studies at the University of Leuven. As always, we very much look forward to your questions, which you can send to me via the webinar chat box, which you can find in the control panel. It's my pleasure now to give the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Nadia Arbatova. You have the floor.
Thank you, Alex, very much. I would like to welcome everyone to our webinar. Of course, it would be much nicer to see you in person, but I hope very much that sooner or later it will happen. The topic of my presentation is a bit broader than the EU-Russia relations, but of course it will include this focal point. I would like to speculate about the impact of the pandemic on the global trends in the post-bipolar world. And let me start with one preliminary remark. After the shock of September 11, of 9/11, everybody believed that the world would never be the same. However, the aftermath showed the opposite, and the Russia-West counterterrorism cooperation proved to be short-lived and did not change the nature of the Russia-West relationship. Likewise, nowadays, many experts and politicians argue that the COVID-19 will change the world radically. And probably you have read the article of Henry Kissinger in the Wall Street Journal, who wrote that the reality is the world will never be the same after the coronavirus. Sounds convincing, but is it? The overall impact of the COVID-19 on globalization is yet to be understood. However, some trends are already clear. First, the pandemic has radically changed the everyday life of ordinary people, which probably created kind of exaggerated perception of the changes in their view. It dealt a heavy blow to the global economy, which is entering a period of deep recession. The baseline forecast envisions 5.2% contraction in global GDP this year, and for Europe, these effects could be even more severe, a drop up to 7%. At the sectoral level, tourism and travel-related industries are among the hardest hit. Economic recession has led to lower energy demand and affect those countries who are dependent on energy supplies, like Russia. Risks are varied and include disruptions in the supply chains. It looks that the so-called reshoring will become an alternative trend to hyper-globalization, and China's major export markets and trading partners in Europe and the United States have been strongly affected by the pandemic, threatening to kneecap any recovery China could begin. Economic security is on the rise elsewhere, and the future of global economic cooperation will depend on policymakers' ability to support their national interests without discarding international cooperation and rules. At the same time, the pandemic has highlighted the importance of the circular economy action plan, not only for the EU Green Deal, but also for the EU security. Now, let me switch to the world politics. As for the world politics, the pandemic was not so much a game changer, but rather a catalyst of those trends that existed before the pandemic. It is already clear that at the level of high politics, the pandemic has not promoted unity of the United States, European Union, and Russia. The common enemy scenario with regard to coronavirus did not work, and it's not surprising if Russia and the West failed to promote their cooperation after 9/11, when they were confronted with a real enemy, real in flesh and blood. It's not surprising that they cannot find a common ground nowadays. Will they be able to freeze their numerous differences on Crimea, on the creeping war in Ukraine, on the reasons of the crisis of arms control regime? The answer is obvious: no. Moreover, the main international protagonists continue to use the pandemic and their political and ideological confrontation. This doesn't exclude, however, cooperation between the scientific and medical communities. Second, the pandemic did not breach the gap between the EU and the United States. With Trump or without him, Europe will continue to be seen as a tool for the US goals. As Sven Biskup, my Belgian colleague, has rightly pointed out, Europe will continue to be seen in a more instrumental way as a source of allies to be mobilized against America's adversaries, and the EU's economic and energy interests as such will never be a priority for the United States. Trump's selfish nationalism can be compared to the jungle-like world. The strongest have an upper hand. Many political analysts and politicians argue that the COVID-19 has accelerated the shaping of the new US-China bipolarity that carries systemic risks for all participants in global relations. However, it should be noted that the blurred bipolarity between the United States and China existed before the pandemic. While the pandemic has strongly affected two poles. The pandemic, or better to say, the US poor performance in fighting COVID-19 has shaken fundamental assumptions about American exceptionalism, the special role of the United States as a global leader. The same can be said about China. In my view, at least one consequence of the pandemic's impact on China is obvious. It has put an end to the so-called Chinese economic miracle. Well, a miracle by definition cannot last forever, but the pandemic accelerated this process. Before the pandemic, China was approaching the role of the second world power center, almost equal to the United States. But the coronavirus dented this image. So if the bipolarity, the so-called bipolarity, becomes stronger, it will be a very special bipolarity with two weakened poles, which means that this situation opens new windows of opportunity for European Union and Russia if they are able to find their proper place in this world politics. Let me say a few words about the US-China conspiracy theories, because they reinforce the split between them. China's critics, first and foremost, the Trump administration, have blamed the Communist Party for exacerbating the virus outbreak by initially trying to conceal it. In recent days, even friendly nations like Iran have questioned China's reported infections and deaths. One top European diplomat warned that China's aid to the continent was a mask for its geopolitical ambitions, while a Brazilian official suggested that the pandemic was part of China's plan to dominate the world. Given China's global ambitions and its centuries-old tradition of face-saving, it is difficult to predict its responses to the possible restrictive measures against the Chinese export and projects. The overreaction of the international community to the role of China originating dangerous pandemics could trigger a negative response from Beijing, which has a wide range of means, from economic to military, to take revenge. And it is precisely this consequence of the pandemic that could adversely affect the world order. Russia and China. Apparently, Russia, in case of a new crisis initiated by the international investigation about China's responsibility, in this case, Russia will side up with China, since their friendship is based on the shared dissatisfaction with the US hegemony. And having this strategic objective in mind, Russia and China have often made compromises and downplayed their frictions, downplayed frictions in their relations. In my view, it would be in Russia's interests if Kremlin took an equidistant position in case of a clash between Washington and Beijing, as China would do in Russia's place, because China never rushes into Kremlin's arms. But unfortunately, as our history shows, Russia can rarely avoid the temptation of two evils to choose both. We have this funny saying. The only hypothetical scenario of a breakup between Beijing and Moscow could be related to possible ethno-social tensions in Russian Far East, tensions between Russians and Chinese migrants. And this hypothetical scenario could encourage Beijing to militarily intervene in such clashes under the pretext of protecting Chinese citizens. The EU foreign policy compass after the pandemic. The COVID-19 broke out shortly after the new leadership of the European Union outlined its ambitious agenda for European integration aimed at upgrading the EU role in the international relations. I fully agree that the EU emergence as a full-fledged power center built on liberal democracy, the rule of law, responsible development, and shared sovereignty could significantly increase stability in the international relations. And it is particularly important at the moment when the global order is moving away from a rule-based multilateral cooperation back into one of old-fashioned power politics. Many experts in Europe and beyond Europe have recognized that the first reaction to the EU to the pandemic crisis has been very disappointing. The EU failed to act early or collectively, despite the scientific expertise, protocols, and potential to do so. But as Immanuel Kant has pointed out, suffering encourages action, and the European Union, after the shock and confusion of the first months, was able to take the lead. And I think that if the member states, the EU member states, find consensus, find compromise on the financial instruments, the EU response to the pandemic will be the strongest in the world. So let us hope that this will happen. Now about foreign policy compass after the pandemic. Angela Merkel recently presented the agenda of Germany's presidency in the EU, and she formulated some principles. For example, she said that the United States, as is important to Europe, as Europe is to the United States, which is understandable, it's a reasonable position. With regard to Russia, she's in favor of the so-called peaceful coexistence and selective cooperation. As for selective cooperation, on the verbal level, the list is very long. We have a lot of problems to resolve together, like proliferation problems, like conflict resolution, international terrorism, crisis of arms control. But in practice, this list is very short because cooperation in the security sector requires the highest degree of trust, and trust is still lacking. So I think that selective cooperation, like it was in with the nuclear program of Iran and agreement, the EU-Russia attempts to save the agreement. So it will be the most we can achieve when the war in Ukraine is going on. It's the main obstacle for real partnership between Russia. I was surprised very much that Angela Merkel did not formulate a clear principle, a clear approach of the EU towards China. And in my view, her presentation had a certain pro-Chinese bias, which is understandable because China is Germany's partner number one. But I don't think that this position will be supported by all EU members because China is being viewed as a partner and at the same time is competitor and opponent. So I'm coming to my last point, that COVID-19 has become a serious test for European integration, and the EU faces kind of twin challenge. It has to cope with the pandemic consequences, and at the same time, it has to address also the old existential problems and dilemmas of European integration. In my view, the strategic perspectives of the European Union require reformatting its political guidelines in order to guarantee the EU freedom of action, to protect European interests, regardless of what the US or any other superpower strategy will be. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Dr. Arbatova, for this initial, I think, interesting insight into how the current crisis is a useful prism through which we can start to make sense of how certain existing trends will develop and the kinds of challenges and opportunities these raise for both the EU and Russia. It's my pleasure now to give the floor to Dr. Sergey Utkin.
Thank you, and I understand that our initial presentations, they're just laying the ground for further debate, and probably there will be questions that will let us explore new fields, not only those that we address in our initial presentations, but nevertheless, I will also say a few words to start, and I will probably pick it up where Dr. Arbatova just left it, which is that a lot of the debate as it develops about the European Union these days, if you look from the Russian angle, is about the EU's actorness. So the question that you ask yourself, whether the European Union in this post-COVID world, in the world that awaits us just around the corner, will indeed be an actor in foreign policy and also in domestic policies that, or so to say, well, the Union's policies that the Union implements for its member states. And during the pandemic, you saw contradictory messages on this particular issue. On the one hand, you saw that in this very important field of healthcare and battling against the consequences of the pandemic, you had still a lot of competences left on the level of the member states. So the European Union that was sort of blamed for not being active enough, it just didn't have the competences, and it still doesn't have the competences to intervene, and probably rightly so, because a lot of steps that had to be made during the peak of the pandemic had to be made not even on the level of member states, but on the level of regions or cities. And this is very understandable if you start analyzing it, if you start deconstructing it. But if you just watch the media debate, then it all becomes like black and white. You have people who blame the EU, you have people who defend the EU, and very few of those who try to dig into the issues and try to find out what particular measures have to be implemented on the EU level and what measures have to be implemented on other levels, including like municipal level, for example, which is in a way the major philosophy of the European Union, the subsidiarity principle that has to be followed when you don't have all issues resolved in Brussels. On the contrary, only those issues that cannot be resolved on other levels have to be resolved in Brussels. So eventually, I think if we keep this in mind, if we keep in mind that it wasn't just about the EU, meaning like Brussels EU saving everyone, we could say that the European Union so far demonstrated the resilience it reached so many times. The resilience became sort of a buzzword in the EU circles, and rightly so, because indeed this is one of the key tasks of the European Union, to show that it is capable to face major challenges and to react to them. But then the question is how the foreign partners of the EU could react to that, and could probably use the fact that yes, the EU is there, the EU is resilient, the EU is not disappearing in relations with this integration entity. One of the most obvious ideas that can come to one's mind is that, well, since this is a healthcare crisis, you could think of cooperation in healthcare, the most obvious thing, which is on the one hand indeed the case, and you can share experience, you can send some help to the other party, but on the other hand, we just saw that many countries during the pandemic felt like they have to make sure they can do the most critical things that are important for healthcare themselves. They don't want to rely on international cooperation that much, even with the established partners. They want to sort of be more autarkic, if you like, not in a pejorative sense, but to make sure that they're able to survive on their own if that's needed. And I think this will to an extent become an instinct for a number of EU members, at least the biggest ones, and probably also the middle-sized countries, that they will try to make sure that they can survive when it comes to healthcare, when it comes to other critical issues. And here we get to a conundrum, that on the one hand, everybody says, well, it's logical to develop international cooperation at the time of the pandemic and afterwards. On the other, you may have more of sort of protectionist instincts, autarkic instincts, because of these fears that at the critical point, one might be left alone. So this is one of the issues to think about and probably to address. Then the other issue that also affects not just the EU, but EU's partnerships with other countries is that, well, ideally speaking, the pandemic should push us to think less in terms of hard security, to think more in terms of human security, to make sure that people are aware that the security is not just about military, that we need to make sure that infectious diseases don't spread, that you do have international cooperation to strengthen the World Health Organization and other measures like that. But in reality, you see the opposite. You see that the whole talk of hard security in Europe, the deteriorating situation on the, well, basically NATO-Russia border is still there, that it hasn't been affected by the pandemic, and we still have to deal with the same issues that we heard about the security in the Baltics, about security in the Black Sea, and it probably means, this is the conclusion that I draw from that, that we still need to address those issues very seriously. Only if we make sure that the level of risk assessments for those issues goes down because of the measures that are taken, because of the confidence building measures, primarily, only then can we hope that people will talk in terms of human security more often and less in terms of hard security. Then what is exactly can be done at the time of the pandemic and afterwards for the EU-Russia relations, given all the limitations that we know, given that they will not be dramatically improved anytime soon. One of the initiatives that draw attention in the European Union lately was, of course, the initiative by the French President Emmanuel Macron. And this initiative has been assessed very critically by many who see that Macron is sort of a lone rider in his relationship with Russia, that he's trying to do what is impossible to achieve. And this is, I think, one of the tests for the EU-Russia relations. So if you have leader of one of the biggest European countries, biggest countries of the European Union, who says that he wants to improve relations with Russia, is there indeed a potential to do that? And of course, as in every other case, it would take two for tango. So it would also take the Russian response, positive response, to make sure that this Macron initiative is more than just nice talk about the necessity of dialogue. So this is one of the tests that we are facing these days. The other test that Dr. Arbatova already partly addressed is the test of the German presidency in the Council of the European Union. I think this is indeed an opportunity, in spite of the fact that Germany did not prioritize the relations with Russia, and understandably so, because probably they don't expect any major progress in this area in the months to come, and the presidency is just for 6 months. Nevertheless, I think we could expect some important discussions between the European Union and Russia, either facilitated by Germany or led with German active involvement as a country that presides in the Council of the European Union. In this audience, I think we all know that the presidency, of course, lost a lot of competences after the adoption of the Lisbon Treaty, but still, I think it gives the country that is the incumbent president of the Council the profile, the political profile to engage into consensus building, not just within the European Union, but also with the EU partners. So what could be the topics to address for the EU and Russia at the time of the German presidency? So that's to say, in the months to come, in the very short-term perspective. I think one of the very critical foreign policy issues that are sometimes disregarded, but I think it's very important for Germany and France and a number of European countries, is the situation in Libya. We just heard, those who followed, that this question about Libya was asked at the press conference to the French president and the German chancellor at their meeting in Meseberg, and we saw that the issue is very delicate, that France is basically outraged by what's happening in Libya. Germany is very cautious because it wants to keep intact the decisions taken at the Berlin Conference on Libya. And here we come to a very critical Russian role, whether Russia could help the EU to reach the stability that is so needed for Libya, or it will be another failure and another disagreement where the EU and Russia and also countries within the EU will not be able to come to a common denominator. So this is one very critical foreign policy issue that I see coming up. Then apart from foreign policy, not that many people notice that, but I see that in the Russian ministries, in the Russian government, there is a growing attention to issues of sustainable development. You might not often indeed hear about that when it comes to Russia, but I think more and more people understand that sustainable development is not just a nice talk on the UN fora, but it's what concerns everybody. If we don't ensure the sustainable development, if we don't make sure that we find a way to tackle climate change, we will all be worse off in the years to come. So I think there are issues in this field, in the field of sustainable development, to discuss between the Russian Ministry of Economic Development and probably the German embassy, the German ministers who might be coming to Russia. And this is basically the focal point of the EU work in what concerns the Green Deal. So this is the priority for the European Union, and this is a point of growing interest in Russia, and there is something to talk about here. The other issue that I think we could explore is the digitalization. We saw how delicate the issue of 5G becomes in the EU, also because of China, because of the reaction to the role of the Huawei. And this is also a conundrum for Russia, because either you use the Chinese technologies or you use the European technologies, in spite of the fact that the European Union remains the entity that imposes sanctions on Russia. This is at least a thing to talk about, and probably to see how the European companies could operate in Russian market, and to make sure that their operation is politically neutral, that their operations are not subjected to the sanctions that we discussed sort of in parallel, and that will not go away anytime soon. And the last relatively big issue that I see, well, probably not as a possible issue for the dialogue between the EU and Russia, but what will affect the relationships between the European Union and Russia is the progress in the development of Russian visa systems. Those who follow Russia probably heard already that there is electronic visa scheme that has already been partially introduced, and it will now be enlarged. So the expectation is that by 2021, the next year, Russia will offer this e-visa system for a large number of countries, including the EU countries, and this will allow a large number of people to travel to Russia more freely. Of course, if we manage to get the pandemic under control. So I think this is a very promising development, because one of the key instruments still that we have for a more stable relationship is people-to-people contacts. If we are able to make sure that people can travel more freely, I think this will be to everybody's benefit. But there are, of course, risks to this sort of constructive agenda that I just outlined. And the biggest risk that I see that is coming sort of from the outside, from a field where the EU is not that much capable and is not able to demonstrate its actorness, is the issue of strategic stability. So basically, if the relations between Russia and the United States deteriorate further, if you have the system of strategic stability treaties collapse and the New START treaty, the main one that is still in force in this regard, may collapse by early next year, then I think this will also affect the European Union. This will affect the abilities of the European Union and Russia to come to any sensible results in this sort of pragmatic dialogue that they could in theory develop. And this makes me worried, because we probably also because of the pandemic, we don't pay attention that much to those remaining strategic stability treaties, to the process around the non-proliferation treaty, which is very important. And if this whole system that survived the Cold War and the post-Cold War years collapses, I'm afraid we will not be able to talk about all those very important topics of sustainable development and digitalization and all others between the EU and Russia, because we will be basically preparing for the worst. This is the risk that we have to address in order to have a better post-pandemic future for the European Union and Russia. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Utkin, for kind of bringing into focus how COVID-19 can be seen as an opportunity for a paradigm shift when it comes to security and a pivot towards human security, and also relating how dealing with the COVID-19 crisis effectively will also open up the possibility of a more constructive agenda with regard to EU-Russia relations, a constructive agenda which of course has its challenges, as you have highlighted. I would now like to bring Irina Petrova into the discussion, and of course remind our audience that we look forward to your questions, of course, as we will soon move on to the Q&A with the audience. Irina, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you indeed to the speakers for the very interesting presentations. What I'm going to do is perhaps start from the observation that I agree with Nadezhda on an argument that the pandemic will not change the world dramatically, and it will, I mean, the statements that the world will never be the same again is a bit of an overstretch in my view. However, at the same time, these processes which we see now, particularly the pandemic, will accelerate the existing trends or perhaps inhibit some of the trends. And this is a good opportunity perhaps to just revisit the EU-Russia relations and see how the pandemic fits into the challenges which we already saw for a couple of years before the pandemic actually emerged. What I'd like to do now is to add perhaps a couple of cents of my perceptions of what's going on in the EU and Russia in terms of their foreign policy priorities, and then in the course of my speech I will just address a couple of questions both to Nadezhda and to Sergey. Well, first of all, in terms of the European Union, I think that obviously it's pandemic, it's yet another crisis. We've seen that the European Union was facing a lot of crises such as migration, Brexit, populism, authoritarianism and stuff like this. And now we see the pandemic, which sort of just fits into all this network of crises. And so the European Union has to realize its limited capacity. So if we look at the capability expectation gap, which was rather wide 10 years ago, I think at the moment it's narrowing down with the European Union realizing what are the capabilities and the expectations, and the capabilities are quite modest sometimes. So the European Union is trying to reformulate its foreign policy in order to adapt it to the existing conditions. The question here, of course, is whether the European Union foreign policy is less ambitious if it tries to adapt to less expectations. And I think it depends on the area and on the region. One could say, for example, like Nadezhda mentioned, that the European Union wants to be and should be strategically autonomous actor and should concentrate really on achieving this goal. Then perhaps less focus, I mean, more focus and less wider approach is useful if it will be able to achieve this objective. At the same time, we see that in a number of areas, the European Union, due to being consumed with a lot of domestic crises, is being less active in its foreign policy and less ambitious as well. Particularly if we're looking at the neighborhood of the European Union, there was always this choice between the stability and democratization, and the European Union was trying to democratize, particularly in the Eastern Partnership states. But what we see recently is that it chooses more and more of stability rather than democratization. So in this regard, it becomes less ambitious. However, I'd like to point out that it's interesting that ENP states, ENP foreign policy actually highlighted that the European bureaucracy is learning, and what we've seen is that the European Union was managing to agree on the package to support the Eastern Partnership states, even before it agreed the support package for the European Union member states. Although we're talking about different numbers, still the fact that the European Union managed to secure very quickly funding for the Eastern Partnership states and refocus it tells us a lot about the learning capacities of the EU bureaucratic system. Another question is about the Russian foreign policy and how the pandemic fits into the processes which already also unfolded in Russia. And this is what Nadia pointed out at the beginning of her talk, is that pandemic is connected to economic crisis, which was already unfolding in Russia. I mean, if we look at how the European Union, how Russia dealt with the economic crisis of 2008, we will see that the Russian economy was hit harder than many other countries. And from here, we can probably make some forecasts about how the pandemic and the related economic losses, as well as dropping prices for the oil and gas, will all together contribute to the Russian major economic crisis. And some of the Russian experts already talking about the fact that Russia might be pushed to the margins of the global economy, which is obviously a big challenge for Russia. Also, given the fact that it's military involved in a number of conflicts all over the world. And of course, here the question is how all these background conditions will relate to the Russian foreign policy. And here I think the obvious consequences is, first of all, that there will be less funding, and foreign policy initiatives would need to be rethought and need to be more cautious, and probably also, similarly as the case in the European Union, the foreign policy will be less active. Also, what we see already, I think, is the changing of tone. The tone of the Russian communication in the international arena, and particularly in the EU, becomes more conciliatory. There is intensification of contacts between the president of Russia with the president of the United States and leaders of the European Union. And also we see the change in the narrative regarding, for example, the economic sanctions, one of the thorniest issues in the EU-Russia relations nowadays. And if in 2014-15, the official Russian narrative about sanctions was that, well, it's the European partners who introduced the sanctions, it's up to them to lift them, we're not going to do anything. And basically the whole idea that Russia will ask for lifting sanctions was immediately put aside. Now, what I see is that more and more Russian political elites formulate the messages sent to the European Union that sanctions are harming both of us. So indeed, we should perhaps rethink this, which is basically a very different change from what we saw just a couple of years ago. I think it's important also to highlight, and this is also what Nadia mentioned, and I totally agree with that, is that COVID unfortunately did not contribute to the fact that we united against the common challenge. This is the problem. And also the fact that the Russian humanitarian aid sent to Italy was perceived as hostile at some point by the EU, and both Russia and China were accused quite on a number of occasions or in propaganda and disinformation related to COVID in the European Union. One dimension which I would like to hear more from the speakers perhaps in the discussion session is the fact how the domestic policy of Russia and domestic processes, socio-economic processes, contribute to the changing foreign policy towards the European Union. And here I'm talking, for example, about the falling purchasing power, which is diminishing every year for a number of years already. What we also seen is the dropping approval ratings of the president of Russia to the historical lows, if we actually trust the Levada surveys, and this is the news which was communicated just a few months ago. And also, I think in contrast to 2014 and this Crimea euphoria, what we see nowadays is that people don't really care about foreign policy that much, and now domestic policy comes first, which was not the case a few years ago. And therefore, it's more and more difficult to legitimize Russian foreign policy, and particularly military involvement elsewhere, because people actually require support in Russian cities, towns, and villages, and so we see sort of isolationist trend to some extent. But indeed, I would like to hear from the speakers more about it, because this is my perception from following Russian developments from the United Kingdom. Another thing I'd like to ask Nadezhda perhaps about is the fact that you were talking about the bipolar world and the fact that we have two weak poles of gravity at the moment. And we don't know yet where we are going with this future international system. But my question would be whether the idea of bipolarity and multipolarity is reflecting the realities of the 21st century. And here I'd like to refer to the idea of Trine Flockhart, who suggested the conceptualization of world order as multi-order world. So we're not talking about nation states, but rather we're talking about several orders. And the difference here is that if previously the cooperation and interaction was between power, but order also consists of power, identity, primary and secondary institutions. And so the identity, although we had several poles of gravity, the identity was more or less European all the time in the 19th century, for example, and in the beginning of the 20th century. What we see now is that we sort of observe the emergence of several different orders, where it's not only power of China, but it's also emergence of sort of Chinese order in a sense that it's also Chinese identity being spilled over the borders of China. And the same holds true for Russia, for example, because some scholars argue that we see the emergence of the Russian order in the post-Soviet space, for example. So the question here would be whether multipolar or bipolar world still reflects the realities, or rather we should think and talk about multi-order world. And in this sense, also the European Union would have to embrace the fact that in terms of identity, it will never be the same, in a sense that it will never be anymore the European identity spread over the world, but there will be different poles of gravity with their own identities, and the European Union would have to recognize it. But in my view, the problem of the EU is that it is not able to deal with other countries or orders with different identities, because even if in the EU global strategy, the whole idea of cooperative orders comes with a remark that it's cooperation with like-minded partners. But then the question is, what do we do with non-like-minded partners? And how do we secure cooperation with them? About the speech of Sergey, I very much enjoyed the fact that you brought the question of resilience, because this is the topic I'm working on at the moment. And basically, I think it's indeed the fact that it becomes a buzzword also helps the failure of the concept, because no one actually cares about it anymore. And I also like the fact that you referred to the local level, because basically this is how Elena Krstelova and myself, we are working in the project Compass, who develops the idea of resilience as local self-governance. The question here, of course, that there is resilience in the European Union, but the EU also uses the term resilience for its foreign policy. But what does it mean? And the fact that I think the European Union still understands resilience as sort of transfer of its own structures and own patterns of development. This is problematic because it's not resilience as it was initially understood in political philosophy when it was the idea of resilience was developed. And so resilience should be indeed about tackling challenges at the source, so at the very local level, but exactly through the local means and via local identities. And this is what the European Union is not doing at the moment in its foreign policy, but I'd like to hear perhaps your opinion on that. Another question is about Macron initiatives to engage with Russia, and you mentioned that it takes two to tango. My question to you is whether the Russian political elites are ready to reciprocate, and what needs to be done so that we have more successful partnership. I think I will stop here. I used my 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. I think there's a lot of food for thought for the discussion. Kolja, would you like to come in with some additional comments?
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex. First of all, thank you very much, Dr. Arbatova. Thank you very much, Dr. Utkin, Dr. Petrova, for your very interesting comments and in fact, talking points. I think we have a lot on the table, and you know, we are talking about this in the context of a project that we all do together, which is basically called EUCROSS, right? The European Union at the crossroads of global order. And the question is basically, which direction will the European Union take after and with COVID-19, because COVID-19 isn't gone yet. But also, how do some of the crucial international partners are responding to the pandemic, and how do they fit in to, let's say, the strategic decisions of the European Union in such a post-crisis scenario. And I was very intrigued by a lot of what you all three have been saying. And let me just point to some reflections that I have on this. You can also comment on them later on in the discussion, but I would also invite, of course, everybody who is also following this webinar to really come up and so to speak, ask questions accordingly. For me, one of the biggest questions is, which direction will the European Union take after and with COVID-19? To which degree is there a closing up of the European Union? To which degree will the European Union be actually as global, as driven by global developments, or to which degree will it actually focus on its own? Of course, we know it cannot possibly do that entirely, but to which degree will actually national self-interest, and in that sense also a regional self-interest of the European Union emerge, that really takes a European Union first approach? I think both Dr. Arbatova and Dr. Utkin have alluded to this already indirectly in their comments. And for me, the big question here is then, to which degree is the European Union really open for connectivity, right? For further cooperation and connectivity in the true sense of the word, or to which degree will the European Union rather seek solutions first at home? Yeah, we can see this already when it comes to investment screening, for example, that the European Union is becoming very protective of its own sphere and its own domestic concerns. At the same time, the European Union prior to COVID had actually been driven by a new narrative that was unheard of course, in the European Union, and that was that geopolitics was really a key word to define the EU's foreign policies in the years to come. What is left of geopolitics, so to speak, after COVID-19? Will the European Union still have, so to speak, this ambition to really invest in also power relationships and to invest in geopolitical considerations? And here I think one of the things that we haven't really tackled is the Belt and Road Initiative of China and the shared neighborhood, if you like, right? You can, of course, this has always been contested neighborhood. Russia has seen the neighborhood as being, so to speak, contested by the European Union through its neighborhood policy, but also now we see that actually China is contesting a mutual neighborhood, right, through the Belt and Road Initiative. So to which degree would that actually open up for space for cooperation in the future, without necessarily, of course, tapping into a minefield, if I may call it that way, and that is, so to speak, a confrontation of China, because I think this is what nobody is really interested in. So it's going to be very difficult for the European Union to actually engage in that. What Macron is doing is actually something that I see very much as a reflection also of Brexit. the security architecture of Europe is now different, that the UK is no longer a contributing factor to the common foreign and security policy, and Macron is looking for new ways of thinking about the security architecture, also because he sees that the US is of course losing interest and playing and using, as you rightly said, Dr. Arbatova, Europe more as a tool rather than as actually a regional partner. And in that sense, Macron is making an offer. But the question is, well, what could possibly be the organizational structure? Are we then talking again about the OSCE? Is that the organizational framework of that structure? If that was the case, well, I guess both Russia and the EU would have to invest in really making the OSCE look a little bit brighter than it looks right now. But that's an open question here as well. What are actually the organizational dimensions? What could actually be the provider of such a security structure? On a couple of other issues here, perhaps, well, if the EU is really interested in cooperating, then I think the European Union should look into diplomatic tools and also should not basically close doors to diplomatic engagement. What I found, personally speaking, what I found a very difficult decision to accept was that the European Parliament closed all its diplomatic contacts with the Russian counterparts. Yeah, basically closing diplomatic contacts and basically extending, so to speak, the tool set of European sanctions to parliamentary diplomacy. Whereas I would think that parliamentary diplomacy should be an open, even if you have huge confrontations, even if you don't agree, you should try to leave diplomatic contacts open. And I think that the European Union should consider some of these contacts in order to find new ways of cooperation. But so would, of course, also the Russian side have to engage and make specific offers to, so to speak, cooperate. What you can see probably is that I think that in the post-COVID time, we will have to work much more together. And here, you mentioned the presidency of the Germans from tomorrow onwards in the European Union, but it has another presidency in the UN Security Council. And here, the big question is to which degree will it be possible to find new ways of cooperating in, so to speak, also the multilateral frameworks. And I think there is a mutual interest of both the European Union as a key supporter of multilateral frameworks, but also of the Russian Federation, which has been a supporter of the multilateral world order and its institutions. So I think here again, the question for me is, well, doesn't COVID-19 perhaps also, you know, people are saying in the context of the European Union, never use a good crisis, never miss a good crisis, but perhaps this is also true for bilateral relations and for a reconsideration towards greater connectivity. And I think this is exactly it. You have to find ways to cooperate on a policy dimension. And I think this has also been mentioned. The question is, of course, what you also said, is there enough trust? So perhaps there can be smaller initiatives around policies where the two can work together. I think sustainable development, as you mentioned, is one of the fields. Another field that I find often very much overlooked is people-to-people relations. What we are doing right now here, right? This is actually a measure that is creating trust. It's an academic exchange, but there are exchanges on multi-dimensional parts of society where people-to-people relations are important. And what I'm fearing is that in the post-COVID world, we will be overtaken too much by our domestic concerns, and that these people-to-people relations are no longer finding the support that they need in order to get a partnership going. Last point, we haven't talked about it, is the Arctic and is also energy relations. I think that's indirectly related to sustainable development. Both of them are, but I think the post-COVID-19 world will also have to make all of us think about the energies that we are using, and there are some tough, so to speak, decisions to be made. We saw that some enterprises like BP have already engaged in the debate and estimate that actually much less oil and gas will probably be used in the years to come, and we can see that some of the bigger corporations are shifting gears towards more alternative energy sources. So here again, I think a lot to be discussed in the bilateral relationship that has been built and has for a long time also functioned because of the energy dependence of Europe on the Russian Federation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kolja for these additional insights and comments. I would now invite Dr. Arbatova perhaps to start with her response.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentations, and I would like to start with Irina's comments. She asked the question about bipolar. I think that after the end of the bipolar confrontation, because there is a difference between the Cold War and bipolarity. The bipolarity ended 1 year after the Cold War, ended in Paris when we had the Paris Summit and Paris Charter. Both Russia and the West had very idealistic perception of the post-bipolar world, since the threat of the global conflict was removed. But the reality and the post-bipolar world, in many senses, is much more complex and unpredictable than we knew from our experience. This doesn't mean that I'm lamenting the old time, no, but I think that the multipolarity can be as dangerous as the bipolarity of the past if we don't have common behavior and if we don't share. And exactly this happened after the end of the old bipolarity. As for the new bipolarity, it was completely different, because the old bipolarity was a confrontation of two different economic and political systems, socialism and capitalism. New bipolarity is developing within the same capitalist system, but it's a confrontation between the liberal capitalism and the so-called authoritarian capitalism. The former is most vividly represented by the European Union and their allies, while the latter by China, their allies. And in the beginning, there was no ideological differences, but ideological differences appeared, at least in the Russia-West relations. And I'm very glad that Irina asked about identity, because it is one of the problems and obstacles for Russia's relations of full-fledged partnership between Russia and the West. In 2012, Russia changed her identity, her European identity, and switched to neo-Eurasianism, which is about Eurasian identity. I think that Russia is a European country, and the criteria of identity is culture. Japan economically belongs to the West, but it's not a European country because of culture. Russia is a European culture, and people ask me to define what Russia is, I always say that Russia is a European country with huge territory beyond the Urals and very tragic history. And coming back to the question about the EU and Russia partnership, I think it won't be possible until Russia makes a final choice, a final solution about her identity and about the model of her future, her future development. Kolja raised extremely points about organizational structure. We don't have any, you're absolutely right, we don't have any post-bipolar organizational structure. I think that we lost the opportunity to create something new when the bipolarity was over. And in my view, the West bears the bulk of responsibility for this missed opportunity, because it proceeded from the understanding that if it was the East that collapsed, we did have to change anything if it was the East. So everything was right in our previous policy, and we missed this opportunity. So what we have now is a heap of bipolar institutions, and the best one is OSCE because it includes all countries, and some hastily innovations like the NATO-Russia Council, which is paralyzed completely. So it's a big question. About multilateralism, I think, yes, Russia is interested in multilateral cooperation. But since Russia is obsessed after the collapse of the USSR with role in the multilateral cooperation, it is much more focused on the process and equal rights with other participants than on the results. So that is my explanation of why multilateral cooperation is not so successful in many spheres. So thank you.
Thank you for these initial replies. Dr. Utkin, anything you would like to add?
Yeah, thank you for very interesting remarks and questions. I will try to address just a few things that you mentioned. First, Irina's remark on the resilience. I think as you do the project on that, you probably know about the works of Dr. Tatiana Romanova from St. Petersburg. She tried to explain what the EU understands as resilience for the Russian audience. She even sort of designed the Russian equivalent to resilience, стрессоустойчивость, to substitute the word that doesn't exist in the Russian language, and that was not easy to find a working equivalent. She also published a book with her colleagues on the EU's resilience, and I think this is sort of a good starting point in the academia to understand each other better. Speaking of resilience in foreign policy, I think it somehow rhymes with what Kolja mentioned on the OSCE and sort of what kind of organizational structure we could use together to get to better mutual understanding and build confidence. Because of course, if you look at what the European Union understands under resilience in foreign policy today, or if you like, not just the EU, but also the Western community, this would be a resilience against Russia and China. So just let's face it, it's what you very often hear in the press, what you very often see in the think tankers debates, and also I think on the academic level you have more and more sort of admission that the nice world where everybody just sits at the same table didn't work, and we have to admit that the reality is more cruel, and to build a resilience just for our community as opposed to the others who are sort of who have malign intentions and who are not willing to cooperate with us. So this is the danger that we face these days, and I think it will not be easy, of course, to create a structure that would bring us all together again. The OSCE, I would tell you, I'm one of the believers in the OSCE. I think that's a good point to start. I think the framework is not yet dead. And you can use it to build upon it. But of course, this requires conditions, and this requires, as it has been alluded a number of times, also the steps from the Russian government. Of course, just looking at the developments from a point of view of an observer, of a think tanker, or an academic voice, I cannot guarantee or tell you that this is sort of my analysis, that the Russian government will necessarily play the game. But I think as we explore what kind of the game this could be, when we understand how everybody's interests could be taken into account, we bring it closer to possible political implementation. So if politicians feel like everybody is just ready to ignore the other side's interests, then they will definitely not play the game. If they see that there are options available that will let everybody's interests to be taken into account, then they could potentially play the game, although of course there are risks. And part of those risks are what Irina mentioned with regard to the domestic processes. I think it's a very long debate, and I don't want to start it right now. But on the one hand, there are people who sort of underestimate this connection between domestic and foreign policy. On the other, you have people who overestimate it and say it's sort of all the Russian foreign policy is just a function of whether Putin's rating is going up or down. I think this is also not the case. You have sort of an understanding of Russian foreign policy interests in the political elite, and you may disagree with them, but it's more than just Putin's rating going up and down. But this is, of course, the issue to address both in academia and in the wider public debate. Of course, some of the disagreements, they actually happen where we sort of get close to each other. And one of those spaces is the common neighborhood. So in this regard, of course, it's very important what will happen in the common neighborhood, because sometimes when people look at the common neighborhood, they say, oh, well, it's just a few countries, middle-sized, not as important as many other issues. But if you look at that from another angle, let's say the Belt and Road initiative that Kolja just mentioned, basically the conflict in Ukraine and the grave deterioration of Russia's relations with Ukraine, it blocked one of the ways that could unite Asia and Europe, just logistically speaking. And the other way, which still unites Asia and Europe, is Belarus. But then the question is whether both the European Union and Russia are ready to develop communication lines going through Belarus, like high-speed rail and others, given the ambiguous attitude towards the Belarusian political regime and all other issues that exist out there. So I think indeed it's one of the questions we have to address very seriously, and I know a number of experts groups are working on that, whether Russia and the EU could get to a consensus in terms of how they see their national interests with regard to their neighbors. If we manage to do that, it would of course be much easier to cooperate also with China on all those infrastructural connections that we would probably all benefit from. I find it very interesting that it was just now that Kolja mentioned, closer to the end of our debate, the Brexit, which I think on the one hand, of course, will have a serious effect on the EU and on possibly also on the EU foreign policy, but it is still completely disregarded, I think, both inside the EU and outside, because people still have the UK on the mental map of the EU. So when they think of the EU, they still somehow think of the UK as well. How fast this will change and in which direction, I think this is one of the interesting issues that we could address. I think it's very important that Kolja mentioned the diplomatic contacts and also maybe parliamentary dialogue. I'm not very sort of optimistic about the results that could be achieved there, but I do think that we have a serious issue both ways, from the EU to Russia and from Russia to the EU, on overuse of blacklisting. So people somehow believe that if they stop certain people from visiting, they achieve something politically. I'm afraid that, well, even if you detest those people, even if you think that they are doing a lot of wrong things, stopping them from visiting is not the right tool. So probably at some point we will be able to address this blacklisting tool and just, well, at least squeeze the room of using it. And I think another interesting comment is on the German presidency in the UN Security Council. I understand that this is just for 1 month, but then it's the short term that at least the policy experts should probably focus on. And if you ask me, if there is one issue to address at this particular point, just for the month of the German presidency, I think Libya would be a nice one to tackle. Of course, a very difficult one, but then if you listen to all sides involved in the dialogue on Libya, they all tell you that what they want is to reach a peaceful political solution. Of course, some of them are sort of more hypocritical on that than others, but since the warring parties remain in the stalemate for such a long time, I think they might also be interested to get to a solution rather sooner than later, because they just get each other exhausted. And the Arctic, I think, is a very important topic to address. We do have a number of Russian researchers working on the Arctic, and my feeling is that the Arctic is a field which is currently on the brink of being securitized. So very soon, if we do nothing, we will only discuss the Arctic in terms of military deployments, and this will do no good to anybody. I think if we manage to keep the debate on Arctic in terms of exactly sustainable development, environmental conditions in the area, and also the use of the transit routes as soon as the Arctic gets partially de-iced, I think this would benefit the EU and Russia and others much more, but there's a certain risk that we will be unable to do that because of other areas where we disagree. So we will not be able to progress in this particular area because we disagree in other areas. This is the unfortunate reality that we currently live in. Thank you.
Thank you, Sergey. And I think we can feed into the discussion a couple of questions from the audience, which both point us towards kind of another piece of the puzzle which we haven't focused on too much thus far, which is how China fits into all of this. And we have one question specifically from Jingxuan Wong, who asks what might be the effect on EU-Russia relations when it comes to Russia-China relations and vice versa. And Patricio Barbirotto, who instead asks a more specific question, looking at the role of the EAEU as an international organization which can work as a bridge between the EU and China through the Silk Road and build a fundamental block of the Lisbon-Vladivostok Common Market project. More in general, do you think the EAEU can play a role in EU-Russia relations as well? Nadia, perhaps, would you like to comment on this?
Yes, the first question was about EU, Russia, and China, right? The first question. Can you see me? Yes. I think that the biggest challenge for this triangle is related to the results of the international investigation about China's responsibility in the pandemic. And if this result would be, if this investigation results in the new US sanctions against China, both Russia and European Union will be faced with a very difficult choice, because China is very important for Russia and for European Union. It's the biggest commercial as a
commercial partner?
As a trading partner, excuse me, as a trading partner. So European Union will be faced with a very, for Russia, I don't have any doubts that Russia will immediately side up with China. But for European Union, it will be a very difficult choice. And we know from the past experience with Iran that many European companies had to choose whether to stay with the European Union decision or whether to accept the US sanctions. In my view, it will be a very difficult moment for the relationship in this triangle. And the second question, I don't remember what it was about
the Eurasian Economic Union.
Eurasian Economic Union. You know, I have written the article which was published in Survival, 3 Phases of Russia's New Eurasianism. And I think that this concept has 3 phases of 3 dimensions. It is Eurasian ideology, in my view, is reactionary. The as for neo-Eurasianism as a politics, it is neo-imperial and expansionist. But the third dimension is quite normal because economic integration is the most normal thing in our world. However, I don't think that this economic integration will be flourishing because, like Eastern Partnership, it includes very different countries with different ideologies, with very different level of development. So it's a normal process, and it will proceed as it can proceed. But I don't accept too much. If European Union is interested in establishing close contacts with this economic structure, it is okay. But I'm not very optimistic about this cooperation. I'm sorry to say it.
Apologies, Sergey.
On Russia and China, I will just add very briefly. Of course, it's one of very important topics, the relations with a huge neighbor, and of course, the developments between Russia and the West in more general terms, not just the European Union, they do affect this relationship. What I am more and more worried with is that as we discuss all sorts of propaganda wars, we find ourselves more and more in the center of the ongoing informational warfare, which is to a large extent concentrated on Russia and China, and they are not even deconstructed. People stop asking questions whether Russia and China can indeed be brought together on every issue or not, what's happening within every actor. It's like you have a huge confirmation bias. Every time you hear a piece of information that offers a critical look on what Russia and China do, if you look from the Western angle, you believe that. Every time you hear anything that sort of questions this critical approach, you think, oh, well, this is some kind of propaganda. And of course, there is also the true propaganda, which can be qualified like that. And this makes things more and more complicated, because in this constant avalanche of propaganda messages, it's harder and harder to get pieces of information that represent critical analysis and probably show to you that it's not that black and white. So this is one of the problems that we get here, and yes, it's one of the issues for Russia in this US-China rivalry. How could Russia find a proper balance, not to get just attached to one of the camps and experience the downsides of this position. The Eurasian Economic Union, I think we just saw sort of one of the manifestations of this protectionist trend that we just referred to in our debate, in the inability so far of the EU to ratify the agreement with Mercosur. So that was an important project for the EU to have an agreement with the Latin American integrationist entity. They had the agreement signed, and then a number of countries, the Netherlands, Austria, they spoke against that. And I think this shows that at the moment, and probably for the years to come, nobody should be very optimistic, to put it mildly, to conclude free trade deals with the EU. maybe the UK will manage, I don't know, but the others will find it complicated, especially the integrationist groups. With the Eurasian Economic Union, it's of course more complicated for the EU than Mercosur, because here there are more political issues, Russia related, and I think we shouldn't expect any kind of free trade arrangement anytime soon. But what we could have is kind of a technical dialogue, and probably even expanded technical dialogue, because there are a lot of issues on trade that could help the businessman on the ground. You could not even have an agreement that parliaments have to ratify, but you can ask the businessmen like what kind of hurdles they face, and act in parallel. You do your part of the work, the counterpart does their part of the work. You could lower those hurdles that affect the business on both sides, and probably at the point of economic downturn, when everybody experiences those economic issues as a consequence of the pandemic, this would be welcomed by every side, that you put down the hurdles. Of course, the mutual sanctions that exist between the EU and Russia, they don't make it less complicated, but even with the sanctions in place, I think there are ways to facilitate the trade, because the trade hasn't stopped between Russia and the European Union. You still have like 40% of Russian trade related to the European Union, and this is an issue to address. It can be very technical. It can be about how to facilitate sort of border crossings and so on, but these are the things that are important for people who transfer those goods from the EU and Russia and back every day. So I think this is one of the issues to address, and part of those issues, due to the separation of competences, will have to be addressed not with the Russian government, but with the Eurasian Economic Commission. So the dialogue with the Eurasian Economic Union is what will go on, but I don't believe in any agreements that have to be ratified by parliaments.
And thank you both for those replies. I would like to give the floor again to our discussants, Irina and Kolja, if you have any additional concluding thoughts as we come to the end of this webinar.
Yeah, perhaps just one small remark to what Sergey just said about the confirmation bias and the propaganda wars. I was doing an empirical study of the narratives, which the European Union narrative regarding the Minsk Agreement and sanctions, and I was looking also at the Russian narrative, and I was looking at the formulation of the narrative and reception on the other side. So how the Russian narrative is perceived in the EU and how the European is perceived in Russia. And basically what I saw is that indeed this is completely confirmation bias and echo chambers. So whatever is said in Russia is completely disbelieved in the European Union, and the same holds true for Russian audience. So I think we are a little bit trapped in this information war. But to be honest, at the moment, I don't know the way out. Thank you.
May I ask a question?
Of course.
Of course.
Kolja, my question to you. The future of European integration is closely related to the EU response to the so-called existential problems. And we know these problems, solidarity, how European Union will be able to erase dividing lines between New Europe and Old Europe, between the North and the South, between Eurosceptics and Euro-optimists. And not only there is a dividing line between Germany and France, and tandem is supposed to be a mode of European integration. We see that Germany is getting more intergovernmentalist, while France is getting more federalist. And if and they agree on the model, on the vision of European Union on strategic autonomy, again at the verbal level. As for practical problems, models of European integration, they disagree on the future. And if tandem is divided, this divide into two Europe, the German Europe and French Europe, it will be a real challenge to the future of European integration. And probably my next question to Irina. Sustainable development implies three factors: economic growth, social progress, and respect for environment. 13 years ago, José Manuel Barroso was asked what European Union was. And he said, European Union is a non-imperial or liberal empire. And of course, it was a figure of speech, just a beautiful metaphor. However, there are striking similarities between the Roman Empire and the European Union in terms of challenges. If you look at the Roman Empire, a chain of interrelated events, climate change, pandemics, crop failures, migration flows, as a result, social tensions within the Roman Empire, overextended borders. And many experts say that the Roman Empire collapsed because it did not pass the sustainable development trend. I see these striking parallels between the situation, between the challenges that European Union is faced with. Will it be able to pass the test of not of sustainable development, but of responsible development? So it's my question to you.
Thank you for that. I think we can start with Kolja and then back to Irina.
Thank you very much, Nadia. I think, of course, we should not forget about this. And Irina mentioned that already. It's still a situation of multiple crises which are basically currently going on, and these crises are essentially coming together while the COVID-19 is basically going to be in additional and has probably already become an additional crisis. We will still need to see what the economic consequences are, but this is also where I would perhaps like to make a connection and basically make very clear that the economic dependence on integration, on economic integration, is very high and large in the context of the European Union. And it's very important that we keep this in mind, that the economic driving actors will still be very strong in order to push for European integration, despite the biggest problems perhaps on the outset. I think this is what still holds the European project together. And I'm in that sense optimistic that the European Union will be able to reconfigurate. Probably it may not always look the same, but I'm also sure that these economic necessities and the societal interdependence that has been built around the economic necessity will be a motivation for most of the members of the European Union to hold on to the idea of the European Union.
Thank you, Kolja. Irina.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for this question. As a historian by training, I'm a big fan of this kind of parallels. I also think that this whole strand of literature which exists in EU studies about EU as an empire is really interesting. And I think the GGS organized a webinar just a couple of weeks ago about the EU conceptualization as an empire. So I think it's a very interesting comparison. Regarding responsible development, indeed, all the three criteria which you mentioned, economic growth, social progress, and climate change, I think the European Union, if there is in the world a successful actor working on all three dimensions, it is the European Union, despite all the problems it faces, particularly on social progress. I'm not mentioning, for example, New Zealand, which is doing a very, very good job recently, but I think the European Union is an actor which shows that it is possible to combine all these three lines of development. And I also would agree with Kolja that I'm optimistic on the future of the European Union and its adaptability, also because from the history of the European Union, we know that from each crisis, the EU emerges more strengthened. So this would be my prediction that although we lost the United Kingdom for the moment, still the European Union will survive, and I think it will be stronger. So in terms of responsible development test, I think the EU will pass it. I hope it is.
And thank you to you, Irina, as well. I think that is all the time that we have for today. But I would really like to thank our panel for the opportunity for a stimulating discussion. And of course to our audience for tuning in and following us. We hope you will join us again next time. So do follow our Twitter page for updates. From all of us, it's thank you and goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you, Alex.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Sergey. Thank you, Irina. Thank you, Alex. Bye.
Bye.